So today we're going to talk about some key equations about ventilation of your alveoli. Ventilation, that's a word you know. This room is being ventilated by a HVAC system. Your lungs are being ventilated by your respiratory system. You're breathing in, you're breathing out, that's ventilation. So I'll use that word from now on. And there are two key equations related to ventilation of alveoli, which is where most of the gas exchange in your respiratory system happens. We're going to have to talk about partial pressure, which is a somewhat confusing concept, but I think I'll try to make it intuitive. We're going to be talking about acid and base equilibria. Some of you have used, maybe already, the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. Those of you who've taken biochemistry maybe are having bad memories of this already.
Econal.
Econal, okay. I will not do what the chemists do with it, but it is an important part of acid-base chemistry, and which is an important function of the respiratory system. So we have to talk about it. And we'll talk about a mode of displaying the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation for respiratory physiology. So just as a reminder, this is ventilation. You breathe in and you breathe out. A certain volume of the air that you breathe in gets into alveoli and participates in gas exchange. A certain fraction of it stays in the conducting airway and does not participate in gas exchange, and that's now called, physiologically, it's called dead space. These numbers are representative. I won't ask you to memorize these, I will not, but this is one of the numbers that I did ask you to put a rough estimate into your mind. And you'll use it, well, I think on problems that I give you values that are close to, but not exactly equal to that. Because there's person-to-person variation. Let's just be clear about why it's not exactly 500.0 mils. It varies from person to person. So here are some key equations that you're going to use in the problem set and that you'll work together with on the problem set and ask me questions about when you're working on the problem set. The total ventilation, now be careful with your abbreviations. TV, tidal volume, I use TV for tidal volume, not for total ventilation. Okay, so if you ever need to write total ventilation, write V-tot or something. Don't use TV, because TV is tidal volume, not total ventilation. Anyway, the total ventilation is just the tidal volume times the frequency, the respiratory rate, the frequency. So it's if your tidal volume is typical, 500 mils per breath, and your respiratory frequency is typical, 12 breaths per minute, your typical total ventilation is 6,000 milliliters per minute. Ventilation is measured in volume per minute. 6 liters per minute, 6,000 mils per minute. I'll accept them. Tidal volume typically at rest is 500 mLs. But if you're exercising, your tidal volume will be bigger, right? And that will, and your respiratory frequency will be bigger. And so your total ventilation will be bigger during exercise. When you're sleeping, tidal volume is probably less than this. Respiratory rate might be half of this. And so your total ventilation could be smaller. So this varies based on physiological need. And by the end of the class today, at the end of the last lecture today, we'll talk about how the respiratory system is controlled by the brain. So remember that alveoli are not completely ventilated by the tidal volume because some of it stays in the conducting airway and is dead space. So to calculate alveolar ventilation, you take the tidal volume, you subtract the dead space, and you multiply by the frequency. And you get an alveolar ventilation number, which is always smaller than the total ventilation number. Some books call this the minute ventilation because it's mils per minute. Just, I'll call it total. It's not minute, it's minute ventilation. Questions about ventilation? Those are real simple ventilation equations. I will expect you to know them. I will not ask you to do calculations. You do not need a calculator. But I might ask you to put, to plug, just put the numbers in, but don't do the arithmetic. I trust that you could do the arithmetic if you give me the numbers, that's all. But you have to know the equations. Partial pressure. So let's talk about partial pressure of a gas, of air. Let's just look at these numbers here. You may know that barometric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. Chemists use that number a lot. 764, I think the chemists use. Okay? That's the total air pressure in this room. Well, less than that because we're not at sea level. And it's also not perfectly dry air. But dry air at sea level, 760 torr, 21% of that air is oxygen. 79% of that air is nitrogen. A low but increasing amount of that air is carbon dioxide. But so the partial pressure of oxygen in air is 160. 21% of 760. That's the partial pressure of oxygen in air. That's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in air. That's the partial pressure of water vapor in dry air. That's the partial pressure of nitrogen in air. Okay, so this makes sense, and it adds up to 760. Now it gets a little bit more confusing, but not much. When you breathe in dry air, you moisturize it, right? That mucus, some of the water in mucus evaporates, and that adds water vapor to the gases that you're inhaling, that get into your alveoli. So moist air in your, let's just call it bronchus, so that partial pressure of water takes up some of that 760 torr, because the partial pressure of air in your bronchus is the same as, the total pressure in the bronchus is equal to the air pressure. So that water vapor displaces oxygen and nitrogen. It also displaces carbon dioxide, but this is a round-off error. It still rounds off to 0.3, okay? So the air that goes into your alveoli, that goes into your lungs, has 150 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen in moisturized lung air is 150. The partial pressure of water vapor is 47. Where did that come from? Well, that's just that's saturated air that has 100% relative humidity at body temperature holds 47 millimeters of mercury of water. So if this room was at 98.7 degrees, and it was 100% relative humidity, which would be really unpleasant, that it would have a partial pressure of water of 47. Water vapor. Nitrogen is displaced by the water vapor as well. So these are the partial pressures of gases in moist air. So those numbers still, the concept of partial pressure makes sense. It's the fraction of the air that is oxygen, the fraction of the air that is water vapor, the fraction of the air that is nitrogen. This is not the fraction, this is the partial pressure. If you wanted to get the fraction, you would take this number and divide it by this number, and that would give you a fraction, a percent. Yes?
So when you say 164 or 0.3 for millimeter mercury, can we use them interchangeably, the units?
Just
Well-
use millimeters of mercury, please.
Okay.
Physiologists don't use torr.
But they're the same thing, aren't they? Are they the same thing?
I think so. You could Google it, make sure. So now, this is air in conducting airway, no gas exchange. This is gas in contact with blood where gas exchange is happening. And the partial pressure of oxygen in the gas in your alveoli is 105, typically. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the gas in your alveoli is 40. Total humidity has to add up to 760, so whatever it does. So this is a gas, and so the partial pressure of oxygen in alveolar gas is 105 millimeters of mercury. So where did the oxygen go? Where did that oxygen go?
The blood?
Went into the blood. And where did this carbon dioxide come from? Came from the blood. Okay, so that's the point. Now we get into the concept that is a little more confusing, and that is the idea of a partial pressure of a gas in a liquid. It's the same thing. It's just that we don't talk about the so when you think of a liquid, you think of, concentration. Has a blood serum has a concentration of sodium chloride, let's say, of about 150 millimolar. Extracellular solution, 150 millimolar sodium, mostly chloride. That's a concentration. You're used to thinking about concentration. You want to think about concentrations of dissolved gas too, but you can't. I mean, it's just not, we don't do that. We could, but we don't. Because the solubility of the gases in liquid is relatively low, but it still has partial pressure. If this gas is equilibrated with this gas, if this liquid is equilibrated with this gas, if it's equilibrated, it will have the same partial pressure. You can see that it's not quite the same because it's not perfectly equilibrated for oxygen. It is perfectly equilibrated for carbon dioxide. It's kind of weird to think about the partial pressure of water in water, but it's there. The relative humidity is 100%. A little bit more nitrogen, making up for the loss of oxygen. These are the partial pressures of these gases in blood plasma. What do I want you to know from this? The gray numbers. So highlight the ones that are gray, because those are the values that I want you to know. You don't have to, so you only have to learn 40% of this slide. So here's a cartoon from your textbook, and I have circled the things that you need to know. So here is the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in air. The book would be better to put, since this is looking like a bronchus or a bronchiole, and this is looking like an alveolus, it would be better to call this 150, right? I mean, if I were writing this book, I would use these numbers, but I didn't write the book, and so they're calling it air. I don't know why they're calling it air. That's not what's in contact with an alveolus. A bronchus is in contact with an alveolus, but nevertheless. Bronchial gas, alveolar gas, 105 and 40. Is this what I said? 105 and 40. Alveolar gas, and just as you said, the oxygen went into the blood and the carbon dioxide came out of the blood. Now really, we should be saying this oxygen went into the blood at the front end of a capillary, because by the time it gets to the back end, the end of a capillary, it has more or less equilibrium. And the carbon dioxide is coming from the input to the capillary, and by the time it gets to the output of the capillary, it has equilibrium. So these arrows kind of are misguiding. This arrow should be over here, and this arrow should be over here, because that's where most of this gas exchanges happen, at the venous, at the arterial end, the front end of a capillary bed. What is the force that is moving oxygen from here to here? Say again?
Simple diffusion.
Diffusion. It's not pressure. It's diffusion. It's diffusion because of partial pressure differentials. What is the force that is moving carbon dioxide from here to here? Diffusion. Passive transport. So alveolar gas is in contact with blood. There was that image that I showed last time of the clusters of alveoli with that each one surrounded by a network of capillaries, lots and lots. This is a minimization of the actual contact between alveoli and capillaries. Fine network of capillaries surrounding each and every alveolus, which is what allows diffusion to equilibrium. So we have arterial blood that has about 100 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen and about 40 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide in the systemic arteries. That is, so all of those numbers are numbers to know. The oxygen is consumed by the cells of your body, right? Oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen, the final electron acceptor. Oxygen is reduced to water in the final step of the electron transport chain in the process of making ATP. So oxygen goes from 100 millimeters of mercury before the capillaries of the metabolically active tissues and drops to 40, 100 to 40, because it's being consumed by the metabolically active tissues in oxidative respiration. Carbon dioxide, which is not particularly low, it's not like 0, it's 40 millimeters of mercury, and it gets higher because where did that carbon dioxide come from? Well, from metabolism, from pyruvate oxidation that produces CO2, and the Krebs cycle, which produces CO2. Your mitochondria produce CO2. Well, and the cells produce CO2. Anyway, CO2 is added to blood at the tissue capillaries. And so the venous blood has a content like that, but those aren't numbers that I'm asking you to memorize. Yes?
So we only have to know the systemic arterial constant or
Yes.
pressures?
Systemic partial pressures of CO2 and oxygen, the alveolar partial pressures of CO2 and oxygen, and air, CO2 and oxygen, air partial pressures. And in fact, some of these numbers are the same. So if you're thinking and you realize, okay, CO2 equilibrates, it's going to be the same in arterial blood as it is in alveoli. Oxygen almost equilibrates, and so it's going to be just a little bit higher in alveoli than in arterial blood. Those are the key things. I mean, air, all I want you to know for air is that partial pressure of CO2, even though we're dumping a lot of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere through anthropogenic, burning of fuel, it's still low. Okay, here's another equation that you need to know because you're going to use for respiratory physiology. What does this say? This is saying that arterial partial pressure of CO2, partial pressure of arterial CO2 is equal to the partial pressure of alveolar CO2, right? That's what we see here. Partial pressure of alveolar CO2 is equal to the partial pressure of arterial CO2 because this equilibration is so efficient. So in general, the partial pressure of arterial CO2 is equal to the partial pressure of alveolar CO2 because of efficient gas exchange. And this number has a value. A constant times the body's production rate, so V dot, it's not a volume, it's a production rate of CO2. And this is alveolar ventilation. So I'm using the jargon that the world uses. Alveolar is capital A and arterial is lowercase a. And I won't take off tons of points if you mix it up, but that's the convention out there in the world. So P little a CO2 is the arterial pressure, partial pressure of CO2. P capital A CO2 is the partial pressure of CO2 in alveolar gas. V dot CO2 is the rate of production. So it's a rate. It's producing CO2 in a volume per minute term. It's producing your CO2 right now. You're not at rest. You're probably producing more than that. I'm producing a lot more than that. But at rest, 200 mils per minute is what your body produces in CO2, just being alive. You're thinking, your brain is probably producing more CO2, so it's a little higher than that. I'm working up a sweat, so it's a lot higher than that. Alveolar ventilation, typical resting value is 4,000 milliliters per minute. We saw that on an earlier slide. So this alveolar ventilation is the same as this alveolar ventilation, just calculated by a different way. So what do we learn from this? We learn that arterial partial pressure of CO2 is generally equal to alveolar partial pressure of CO2. That there is a linear relationship between partial pressure of CO2 and the production of CO2. And there's a reciprocal relationship between partial pressure of CO2 and ventilation. You do not spend a lot of mental energy memorizing this number. This number you can look up or I'll give it to you. But I do want you to know how to set this equation up. And if you set it up, partial pressure of alveolar CO2 is equal to something. You want to put the production of CO2 in the numerator and the ventilation in the denominator. If you don't set it up right, you're going to get completely screwed up. So let's talk some more about acid-base, carbon dioxide and acid-base chemistry. I'm not a chemist, but I gather chemistry vibes just from being in this room. Carbon dioxide is it's an acid. You don't think of it as an acid, but at least in a watery environment, it is an acid because carbon dioxide and water associate to make carbonic acid. This is carbonic acid. This association is accelerated by an enzyme that is all over your body called carbonic anhydrase. cells all over your body, and we'll need to know this later on when we talk about oxygen transport. I mean CO2 transport. This equilibrium happens even in the absence of carbonic anhydrase, just like all enzymatic reactions, but this enzyme accelerates this reaction. And you may remember from self-is that we drummed into you, this enzyme does not push the reaction one way or the other. This enzyme simply makes the reaction go faster. That's what enzymes do. So it doesn't push it that way, it doesn't push it that way, it just makes it go faster. Carbonic acid dissociates into hydronium ions or protons, and its associated base, bicarbonate. So this is bicarbonate. So when I talk about bicarb or bicarbonate, it's HCO3 minus. It's the conjugate base that comes from the dissociation of carbonic acid. So let's just play around with this. If there is increased CO2 in your body, elevated CO2 because you're not ventilating enough. Let's just say you're producing CO2. Let's imagine a situation where you were exercising, but something was preventing you from increasing your respiratory rate and your tidal volume. So you were ventilating at, say, a resting rate, but your body was producing 10 times as much CO2 as it was at rest. That would be hypoventilation, low ventilation for the needs of the body under those conditions. You would build up CO2 because your metabolically active tissues are churning out CO2, but you're not ventilating it. So high, right? I mean, if we're making a lot of CO2 and we're not ventilating it, we're making a lot of, this number goes up. This number goes up. That's what we're talking about. High CO2 will drive this equilibrium to the right, just by mass action. High CO2 pushes the reaction forward. More acid, low pH. You have to remember the reciprocal relationship between acid concentration and pH, right? That's basic chemistry that you need to remember. And it gets you confused, but you have to get past the confusion. High acid concentration, low pH. Let's just say you're hyperventilating. You're sitting here at rest, your body's not exercising, but you're highly anxious and you start breathing really fast. Hyperventilation. You're ventilating more than your body needs. So your CO2 concentration goes down. Your partial pressure of CO2 goes down. Hyperventilation, low CO2 draws this reaction to the left, mass action. That lowers the amount of proton. Lower proton, high pH. So this is what the respiratory system does. We're going to talk in the next section about what your kidneys do to control bicarbonate ion. So your kidneys are primarily responsible for controlling bicarb. Your lungs are primarily responsible for controlling CO2. And together, they control pH because of the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. So, I hope you remember that an acid, like carbonic acid, dissociates into protons or hydronium ions. I don't know what the chemists here like to use. And its conjugate base. So in the reaction we're interested in, this is carbonic acid, this is bicarbonate, and this is proton. This is general, this is specific. Those of you who have taken Econal have worked with this equation, at least some.
More than some.
More than some. And this is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. Right? How many of you have seen this and worked with it and wished you had, well, no, just how many of you had seen it and worked with it? Okay, most of you. You don't need to know this equation. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this equation. And I'm not going to ask you to memorize this equation. Because we're going to use it, we're going to do a graphic version of it. Just a minute. So this is the general Henderson-Hasselbalch equation for all acids. This is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation for CO2 as an acid. CO2 becomes carbonic acid, which dissociates into a weak conjugate base and a strong acid. So Henderson-Hasselbalch, there's the same term there, there's the same term there. Now, the concentration of the acid, we could use the concentration of carbonic acid, but we are more interested in carbon dioxide. So we take the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and multiply it by its solubility as a measure of the concentration of the acid. So this term is this term. This is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation for carbon dioxide and bicarbonate in solution. Carbon dioxide in solution, bicarbonate has a concentration in blood. It's just the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. I don't want you to memorize it. Because what we're going to do instead is the Davenport diagram. So I'm going to do this now because you're going to use it for your problem set. So I want to give you everything you need to know for the problem set. And this could be on the exam. So it's in the first lecture. So I'm going to do something a little bit fancy-ish here. I'm going to walk through this because it looks like, oh my God, what's all that? I'm going to walk through it so that it becomes more sensible. I'm going to make it intuitive sense. So I just want to, I'm going to erase the PowerPoint in a minute. I just want to get superimposed on this, right? So that's all I really want to do. So this is called the Davenport diagram. And it plots the concentration of bicarbonate in blood plasma with the units of millimolar. That's the y-axis. Online students, can you see me when I'm writing over here? Good. As a function of the pH in pH units. Yeah, I just want to I'm going to turn this on for a moment. Here. This is where you are at rest in terms of bicarbonate concentration and pH. Your resting bicarbonate concentration in blood is about 26 millimolar. Your resting pH in blood, so this is blood pH, your resting blood pH is 7.4. Online students, is this too low for you to read? Am I off screen here? No, okay, good. That's where you are at rest. The Henderson-Hasselbalch equation has a you know, if we go to a higher pH or to a lower pH, or we could go to a lower bicarbonate concentration or a higher bicarbonate concentration. Let me put back up the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. The Henderson-Hasselbalch equation is a relationship between pH, which we plot on the x-axis, and bicarbonate concentration, which we plot on the y-axis, at a given partial pressure of CO2. So we say, okay, given a partial pressure of CO2, there is a relationship between bicarbonate concentration and pH. That's what this says. And if we graph it at a given partial pressure of CO2, we get a curve that looks like that. So at a normal partial pressure of CO2 in blood of 40 millimeters of mercury, right? That's one of the values I've been asking you to learn. This is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation at this partial pressure of CO2. We've set a CO2 partial pressure, and now the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, the relationship of that equation of pH as a function of bicarbonate concentration produces a curve like this. If you hyperventilate, is your partial pressure of CO2 the same as this? What is it? Is it higher or lower? Lower.
Lower.
Hyperventilation. The way to think about it, if you're hyperventilating, you're blowing off CO2. You're ventilating off more CO2 than your body is producing. Hyperventilation, low partial pressure of CO2. So in hyperventilation, PaCO2, let's just say 20 millimeters of mercury. That's really low, but not really lower. Millimeters of mercury. So if we hyperventilate, so there is a Henderson-Hasselbalch equation at this fixed partial pressure of CO2. And it looks just like this one, except that it's shifted to the right. That's ugly. That's the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation at this partial pressure of CO2. And what if we hypoventilate? We're not breathing enough for the body's production of CO2. Well, you can sort of see where I'm going. If we have a PCO2 that's high, we're going to be over here. This break here is just because I don't want to draw too much on this piece of, there's no break, it's a continuous line. This is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation at this partial pressure of CO2. This is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation at this CO2. This is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation at this CO2. So now, let me ask you, where would I draw the line if the partial pressure of CO2 were 30 millimeters of mercury? Draw it in here somewhere, right? And where would I draw it if it were 42? I'll draw it a tiny bit over here, right? The point is, this is a whole surface. We use three concentrations, three partial pressures of CO2 as an illustration, but our bodies can live anywhere on this chart. I'm just illustrating three Henderson-Hasselbalch equations at 3 different partial pressures of CO2. So let's illustrate some physiology with this. You get anxious and you're normal. Let's just say you're normal. At the normal point, 26 millimolar bicarbonate, pH 7.4, normal. You start to hyperventilate. So you move from this curve to this curve. Let's say you hyperventilate all the way to 20 millimeters of mercury. But on the way, you moved from 40 to 38 to 36 to 30, da da da. So hyperventilation is moving from this point to this line. And I can't really explain why we don't just draw a horizontal line. It has to do with the buffering of your body. We draw a line that looks more like this. So this is hyperventilation. What is your body going to do in response to hyperventilation? Well, it could do I'm illustrating 2 things. It could try to reverse the hyperventilation, right? Let's just stop hyperventilating. Okay, well, that would be moving back this way. If you're controlling the hyperventilation, you would move back along the same line. But say you can't control hyperventilation. I don't know if any of you have ever seen or experienced an anxiety attack, but they're extreme, and it's hard to, you want to say, just stop breathing like that. Well, it's not so easy, and it's terrifying to both the people around them and to the person who's experiencing it. So your body, I just want to make a point here, that during hyperventilation, your pH is abnormally high. This is called alkalosis. And so this would be called, so hyperventilation is equal to respiratory, because it's coming from the ventilation, respiratory alkalosis. pH is too high because the respiratory system is not working right. Hyperventilation. Respiratory alkalosis. Your body, your kidneys mostly, so you can change your ventilation, but sometimes you can't do that. Your kidneys want to control your pH at 7.4. They don't want to be at 7.5. Your body wants to be at 7.4. So we have a mechanism for excreting bicarbonate along this curve, right? Your lungs are saying partial pressure of CO2 is 20 millimeters of mercury. Your kidneys are saying, well, okay, fine, if you want to be 20, I'm going to get rid of bicarbonate so that the pH is normal. And so this is the metabolic compensation. Metabolic just means something other than the respiratory system, and it's usually the kidneys. We don't say renal compensation, but that's really what it is. And we'll get into the renal mechanism after your exam, next section. Because your body is, has evolved to be close to pH 7.4. Okay, so we've got hyperventilation and metabolic compensation for hyperventilation. Let's do hypoventilation. Where do you suppose we go with hypoventilation? Hypoventilation. Breathing too little for the needs of the body. Asthma. Constricting the airways, getting too little air into the alveoli. So this is, now we're talking about hypoventilation. ventilation. The pH is low. What would we, now use your pattern recognition skills. If this is called respiratory, if hyperventilation is called respiratory alkalosis, what is hypoventilation called? Respiratory acidosis. So hypoventilation is also called respiratory acidosis. And your metabolic response to hypoventilation, obviously your lungs would say, okay, no, I've got to ventilate some more, and you would increase your respiration. But if you couldn't, or even if you could, the response of your body is going to be to go up the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, retain more bicarbonate, your kidneys retain bicarbonate, in an effort to re-normalize the pH. The pH is what your body needs to control. The enzymes of your body have been evolved to work in a very narrow range of pH. We don't care about bicarbonate other than its ability to control pH. We don't really even care about PCO2 other than its ability to control pH. It's the pH that matters. And so if you hyperventilate, you control the pH by getting rid of bicarbonate. If you hypoventilate, you retain bicarbonate in order to get the pH back to where it belongs.
How fast is this reaction by the kidneys? Because
It can take hours.
It takes hours. Okay, so how long can our enzymes survive at a lower, at a higher pH? Because like we've learned in biochem that like a lot of the amino acids have very specific pHs. So then if you don't have it in that, then you might get rid of an H, which then changes the structure. So
My
where would that
understanding is that we're not destroying the enzymes at high or low pH.
Okay.
We are rendering them less optimal, they have an optimum of function, of rate.
Okay.
And we want them to be near their optimum rate at 7.4. And, we want them to be near 7.4 so that they are functioning at their optimum rate. But, so, at 7.3, we're not killing the enzyme, we're just rendering it less functional.
Okay.
And so if we get the pH back up, if in an hour we get it back up, we're okay.
And
So obviously you can die
if you go
of
super low.
hypoventilation.
Mhm.
I guess you can die if the pH goes too high, but this is normal physiology, normal hyperventilation, normal hypoventilation. This is not a fatal condition.
What would happen to people that have kidney problems then?
Okay, kidney problems.
Like, we wouldn't be able to do this metabolic compensation, right?
Well, then you'd be in trouble.
And that's why people do dialysis?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's part of the reason why people do dialysis. The other reason is that the other function of the kidney is to get rid of toxins, metabolic waste products. That's important to do too.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that with the kidney.
Very cool.
So this is respiratory physiology, respiratory alkalosis, respiratory acidosis, and metabolic responses. There's other things that we can do, and I'm just going to mention this quickly because it won't be on the test. But what if you have, let's go back to the normal place. Your body produces too much acid. How could your body produce too much acid? Athletes. Anaerobic respiration. The painful feeling of your muscles as it generates lactic acid. Lactic acid it's not carbonic acid, it's a different acid. So in the case of metabolic acidosis, That would be metabolic acidosis. You're breathing normally. You're on the normal Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, but you're producing some other acid. What is your respiratory system going to do in response to metabolic acidosis? Well, we have to use the muscles. Let's say we're running away from a bear. We need to run as fast as we can for as long as we can or we're dead. So we can't just stop running. What else? I mean, yeah, we can stop running, but then we get killed by the bear. What could our body do? Breathe more, ventilate more, move back towards a normal pH. Is this hyperventilation? No, this is respiratory compensation for metabolic acidosis. Okay, so this is respiratory compensation for metabolic acidosis. And now, what's another condition? Let's do, what if your body is excreting too much acid? How could your body excrete acid? Way up, sort of abnormal. Unpleasant to think about. What? Urine is typically neutral, but that's possible. But
Eating a lot of meat?
no, that doesn't do it. Vomiting is the excretion of stomach acid. If you have uncontrolled vomiting, which happens, you will go into metabolic alkalosis. And so this would be metabolic alkalosis. We're going to do this again when we get to the kidneys. What would your respiratory system do to try to compensate for metabolic alkalosis? It's going to hypoventilate, but it's not hypoventilation. It's lowered ventilation, a respiratory compensation for metabolic alkalosis. So let me put up the slide. And see how well I did. Well, you won't see because it's behind the screen. But that's not the one. So we talked about respiratory alkalosis and metabolic compensation. We talked about respiratory acidosis and metabolic compensation. This slide actually is specific. It says it's the kidney that does the compensation. We've talked about metabolic acidosis, lactic acid, and respiratory compensation. Let me give a challenge question. If we caused metabolic acidosis, and we want to talk about not the respiratory system, not the respiratory system's compensation, but renal compensation for lactic acid acidosis. So no change in respiration, but renal compensation. Where would I go? What would the arrow be? Would I go this way? No. Would I go this way? No, that's respiratory compensation. We would go this way. If it's not respiratory, we're staying on the same line of PCO2. So metabolic acidosis, renal compensation, respiratory compensation. I do want you to know the respiratory bits, and I do want you to know the renal compensation bits to respiratory problem for this exam. And we'll come back and do this in more detail, the whole 9 yards for the next exam. Question?
So renal compensation is the same as metabolic?
Yeah. renal compensation and metabolic compensation are pretty much the same. But the point is, respiratory alkalosis says the primary problem is a respiratory problem, and here's the renal response. Metabolic alkalosis is a body problem that's not respiratory, and this is the respiratory response. Yes?
Why do you get this when you hyperventilate?
I don't know. I have to look that up.
So if we're in a place where we cannot control the amount of carbon dioxide that we breathe in or out, can we control the amount of H plus that we take in out?
No. The way we control our pH is through controlling bicarbonate and CO2. That's how we control pH. So the next slide just is some examples. So respiratory acidosis is hypoventilation. I put that up before. And so you could think, asthma, inadequate ventilation of the alveoli. Emphysema, destruction of alveoli. Dyspnea is just a word for bad breathing. Respiratory alkalosis, hyperventilation. Well, anxiety, altitude. If I were to take you and transport you instantly to 12,000 feet, 3,000, 4,000 meters, your natural response would be to hyperventilate because of oxygen hunger. Low partial pressure of oxygen would say, I need to breathe more. But you'd be breathing out, you'd be blowing off more CO2 than you need to. And so you would be hyperventilating. You're just sitting at 15,000 feet and you're breathing real fast, you're hyperventilating with regard to pH. Not with regard to oxygen, but with regard to pH. And so that can cause respiratory alkalosis.
Is it true that people that live at higher altitudes have bigger lungs?
They have bigger lungs and they have adjusted, their kidneys have adjusted to a lower PCO2. And we'll put the metabolics aside, but I think I used vomiting for metabolic alkalosis. If you excrete tons of acid, your body gets alkaline. If you do anaerobic metabolism and produce lactic acid, your body gets acid. So let's stop there. That's an hour. You have a bunch of clickers. You have your problem set. I want you to go to your Zoom